Well, thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you for letting me share this moment with you, kicking off Leadership Month. Today we're talking about leading transformational change. And that, if we were fishing on a game boat, we're going marlin fishing here, we're dealing with the big ones, leading transformational change. It's a complex thing, and we want to share today some ideas, give you some things to talk about that might add to your toolkit, that might let you leave here today with something about maybe I could try that, maybe that's a different way to look at it. So that's our journey today. We all know with change, even if we go back to Darwin's view, people say we're in the fourth industrial revolution now. The amount of change is massive. And as Charles Darwin told us so long ago, the strongest and the wisest aren't necessarily the ones that succeed. It's rather those who are adaptable. So change is a must for us all. Change is the only constant in life. It's a tried and tested quote from 500 BC. It's been around a long time. But some would argue, and indeed I think there's some truth to it, that the rate of change in our organisations is increasing. It's not so much a constant, it's an accelerator. Some research would suggest that in the last 3 years, 5 agency-wide changes, typically, in any large organisation. Have you encountered any large changes here? No? There might be outliers. Yeah, agency-wide change. What's more troubling, though, I think, for us to consider, and certainly I hope this talk is of use, is as leaders, we're going to be responsible for managing an increase in change in the next 3 years. We're literally putting an X or a multiplier over the number of changes that are likely, that we will need to lead together, that we will need to go on the journey and take our staff through. And that is a challenge. That is a challenge. The same data sets that those statements come from, they analyse whether change succeeds or not. And as you can see on the screen, the pure yes, that worked is 34%. The some worked, some didn't, 16. And that clearly did not work is at 50%. 50% failure rate. Some research would put that up at 70% failure rate. And so this is a bit troubling, I think. If major change initiatives have a 50% failure rate and we're doing multiple of them over the next couple of years, we've got to really think carefully about change. Because 50%, that's a toss of a coin. Would you agree? A toss of a coin. So you do all that stuff, you get ready to launch a change, and then, you may as well just flick a coin and see what happens. Why don't we flick a coin now? See what happens. I want you to decide, I'm going to flick the coin, and I want you to decide, is it going to be heads or tails? Heads means, of course, we're going to smash it, we're going to succeed, our change is going to go fantastically well, and tails, of course, puts us in the other end of the equation. So hands up for heads, who's thinking it's going to go heads and we are going to win? And what about tails, who's thinking, oh yeah, no, it's going to be tails. Here we go. Alrighty, tails. Oh, man. That was expensive. Best of 3. I love that. What about 2 up? I think that gets worse. Tails. And that's not an unusual finding, is it? Tails just then. To realise that perhaps there are indicators that things won't work. And the trick, of course, is, or the first thing we have to recognise as a health service, is 50-50 is not okay, is it? It's not okay. If you think about change and the impact of change that doesn't work on staff morale and performance, you'll know that those things are dragged down. And then if you think about patient error rates in a low morale culture, you'll see a connection in this stuff. So we can't afford to do change perhaps the way it's been done before. We have to do something different. We really need to increase our odds. Wouldn't you agree? Our staff deserve it, and our patients deserve it, and our community. We've got to, as leaders, we've got to increase our odds. And it's not just increasing our odds. What we really want is a double-headed coin. Wouldn't you agree? We want certainty with change. We want to know that every change initiative we do is going to work every time. That's really the standard that we're looking for. And look, I think we can do that, okay? I think that we can, if we understand these three things. Dig deeper beneath the surface today about human nature and change. Understand these and avoid these classic leadership mistakes. And then have a look at these four, what we call the 4 change factors for the fast track, how to make sure you succeed. And so that's our journey in this keynote this morning, is to unpack those toolkits and give you things to think about, give you different perspectives on how to consider change and as a leader, how to lead change. If we start with number 1, understanding the human, we go back to our old iceberg, because when change isn't working, before we think about our leadership of that change, we need to go to our staff, the people experiencing the change, and walk a mile in their shoes. As Brene Brown, Naomi quoted before, we need to empathically kind of understand their journey and understand what's going on there. And one of the things that we often fail to consider before we even start is the impact of work just as its own construct. We spend more time at work in our lifespan than any other activity, except perhaps sleep. Although I've got young kids, so I'm definitely not getting enough sleep. Most of us don't look at life that way. We don't see work, that place where we spend all our time and give our heart, as our great love. We think our spouse is that great love. And indeed, they may well be. But as leaders, we forget just the sheer amount of time our staff are spending in this organisation. And that's important because it's where our strongest connection to routine is. It's where we are unconsciously repeating, like train tracks, neurologically, over and over again, the routine of our lives. And work, therefore, is the daily grind. But whether we love it or hate it, it's a safe haven. It's a predictable thing. And sometimes it's the only predictable thing we have. Yeah, as our kids do their crazy things, as our relationships strain and stress, as our bodies age, sometimes work is the one predictable thing. And so as leaders, as soon as we change something, we change that routine. And that means that whether my work routine is high morale, I come in and I articulate all sorts of things I enjoy about the place, or low morale, I come in and I complain about the place, that's my routine. And as soon as you change something, you disrupt my routine. And I may not have conscious awareness of that. I might simply start to wrestle with the disruption and not even know why. And so if we think about that, a staff member going through change, we need to understand 3 areas or check off in our heads that I've thought about that if I'm dealing with someone who doesn't appear to be going well in change. Things about the past, the future, and things about the present. As leaders, when we grasp these things in our leadership, we do so much better leading change. If we start with the past, one of the interesting things I've experienced in the machine of government and being a partner in driving major change projects is that when you announce change is coming, not everybody smiles. Have you ever been in your team and you say, hey, there's this change, and instead of everyone, popping streamers and, just confetti bursting through the ceiling, instead of that magic moment happening as you announce this new thing's coming, people stare at the roof hoping it'll crash down on you. People become angry and upset about change, or at least this proposed change. And if you take a moment and put your psychologist hat on, how could you be upset about something that hasn't happened yet? So if they're angry about change, we have to understand what that anger is, what's causing that anger. And they can't be angry about the change yet because it hasn't happened. It would have to happen, and sure enough, it was a bad change, and that's my anger. But all you've done is mention it, and now I'm upset. So as you can see here, when we think about grief and loss, we know where anger sits in that continuum. We know when someone's angry where to place it. And we know not to fight with it. We know how to accept it as part of an adjustment journey. And so when you're dealing with your staff and you're trying to introduce some change and people are angry, the first thing we like leaders to consider is, if the change hasn't happened yet, maybe what they're angry about is the threat to their routine, the disruption to the one thing in their lives that's predictable. And maybe if we recognise that and leave it alone, or take a different way to chat with our staff, if that's what's really going on for them, maybe that will bring us together and help us journey more than potentially getting into a logical argument, a standoff. So much of our anger in life, as we psychologists know, is displacement. It's displacement about grief, and grief simply about the routine we have is under threat. So that's the first of our human factors. The second one's pretty straightforward. My work in schools, we talk about pedagogy. I don't know if there are any education people here. Anyway, that's simply how children learn. And then in adult learning, we talk about andragogy, how adults learn. The image on the screen simply points out the obvious to many of us, which is for adults to retain information and start to change their own behaviour. If you explain it to them, give them something to read, even a nice video, that's the least likely way they're going to change. They're going to be able to take that information and change. If you give them that information and immediately they have to use it or attempt to explain it to somebody else, that's the most likely way they will get across the change bridge and start to change their behaviour. And the problem, of course, here is we don't get paid to practice, do we? We don't have double the amount of time to treat our patients or to do our work, where half of that's devoted to making mistakes and just feeling it out, and the other half's supposed to be correct. Once we're senior leaders in an organisation, we're expected to be able to just do it. And we need to think about that. Has that person had enough practice time? You know, what's going on inside them? Are they simply attempting to execute the new change based on all they read? Where was the interposing step for them to try it, to be messy with it, to make a mistake? Do you even give yourself time to be messy with stuff before you have to deliver on it? Or do you put yourself under so much pressure that you learn it and then you just head out there and execute? The final one, and this one's really important. Flight attendants, nurses, paramedics, police officers, teachers. They all have very high rates of emotional dissonance. Emotional dissonance being when you have to appear calm and happy and you have to keep smiling away, even though on the inside you're actually quite frustrated, distressed, traumatised. You have to just keep going because that's what is required of your job. And when we think about going through change on top of that, because many of our staff are featured in high emotional dissonance in workforce stress, we're doubling the burn rate for these people, okay? When they're normally doing their job, there's a certain amount of distress they have as patients are hostile to them or if they have to cope with stuff. But if they're doing that normal job and on top of that we're now in the middle of a big change, we're doubling the burn rate by which they can become distressed. We have to recognise the impact of change personally. And so they're the things that sit beneath the surface in all of us. We're forever having to deal with increments of loss of our old routine and embracing new. And that's creating a sense of urgency to learn, but we're not giving ourselves enough time to practice. And then beyond all of that, it's inherent in our job in certain times that we have to be professional, that we have to be fine, and we have to keep going. So as you lead change, that's our first thing to consider. What's going on in the people around me? Because that's going on in all of us. And your ability as a leader to tick that off or ask a good question about that in the people you serve is going to dramatically improve your effectiveness. Our second one is avoiding the classic leadership mistakes, okay? Basically, there are things that we do that may appear okay, that might make sense, but on another level, when we look inside transformational change, particularly as psychologists, we know it's not a good idea. So we put a hazard warning up at the start of this section. Okay? Naomi told us that we sometimes need to unlearn, and we think about leading transformational change. This is often a period of time, this part of our talk, where some of us have to do some unlearning. So let's see how we go. There are 4 classic leadership mistakes leading transformational change: smoke and mirrors, positional power, what we call the close communication bias, and the unreasonableness of time. They're our leadership things to consider. If we start with smoke and mirrors, has anyone heard the term? Yeah? Smoke and mirrors. Yeah, you get a lot of private fun discussions about smoke and mirrors. There's two types of smoke and mirrors to consider. There's the false perception of choice. Has anyone been in an environment where they said, oh, we're just going to pilot this new idea? And you go, oh, righto, sure, yeah, can we have some volunteers? You try it, and then if you think it's good, we'll keep doing it. Or, we'll take on your suggestions and modify it before we sheep dip everybody else. Anyone ever heard of that? You can leave your hands down if you've heard of that. Good. Okay, and then, of course, what could happen there, this false perception of choice, is, halfway through that pilot phase, as that smaller team's done all these things to make it better, they just launch it on the whole organisation. And none of that effort, has led to any improvement. None of those suggestions are taken on, and people naturally feel like it was a false consultation. Has anyone heard of false consultation? Again, leave your hands down. Cool. So, that's our first sin. The second one is overstating the benefits. Yeah? Have you ever been at work and there's a change and everyone says, it's going to be amazing. It's going to literally transform healthcare. It's just going to be unbelievable. You're not want to go home. You're going to love your job more than anything else. Have you ever raised your eyebrows a little bit or frowned like I am, going, oh, really? It's going to be that good, is it? People don't like to be sold, do they? But they love to buy. Has anyone heard that quote? Yeah. And so smoke and mirrors is where we accidentally find ourselves selling instead of creating the space to buy. The other fun fact here, of course, is human beings, right? They can speak at 150 words a minute, maybe 160 if they speak a lot. But the average human brain can process at 800 words a minute. So what are you all doing right now with your extra 650 words? That's what worries me. If I multiply out this room, there's gigabytes and gigabytes against me. I can only do 150. So if here am I up the front, doing smoke and mirrors to you, and you've got that much spare bandwidth, it means I don't stand a chance, doesn't it? Because you're either sort of thinking about something else with that 650 words, or you're microanalyzing my behaviour and the congruence or incongruence of my messaging. I don't stand a chance. So the solution to this one is make change boring. Yeah, not a very exciting message, is it? Make change boring. Yeah, but it is, if you think about human beings. You need to normalise change, normalise what's coming through, and try to keep people inside that comfort zone where they're able to process things, where they're able to maintain their emotional energy, and they're able to embrace this adaptation that they're trying to cope with. Sometimes that can be a bit of a head trip, make change boring. It's quite counterintuitive because we often go razzle-dazzle as we launch new initiatives. And indeed, there's a time and a place for that in politics and policy. But if you're trying to get an individual do something different at the team level, at the individual level, you want to aim for the comfort zone. A couple of quick illustrations here. Does anyone try to get their kids to have new foods? Has anyone done that? Yeah, just me. Yeah. I used to try to always have the 18, she's 18 now, Emma, but when she was younger, I'd try to get her to try new foods pretty regularly. And one time I wanted to get her to try kangaroo. Yeah? So I could either explain to her, overstate the benefits. Hey, Skippy, remember the movie? Yeah, we're going to eat Skippy today. How awesome is that going to be? And that probably wouldn't have worked so well, would you agree? Yeah, it's weird. Dad's wigging out. Or I could tell her, oh, we're having steak tonight. Both are true, aren't they? It was steak, by the way, kangaroo steak. Yeah. And so we all know with kids, my wife, lovely, I do it too, we blend the carrot and the peas into the spaghetti, right? What are we having tonight? Our little ones say at the other end of my family. Well, we're having spaghetti. That's true. It's laced with broccoli and, rat sack and everything else the kids hate. But we're having spaghetti. So think about that for a moment. Think about how you even talk about the language of change. Remember, what you want is the changed behaviour. So the language is about comfort. So we cooked up this steak. We had steak. Kids loved it. And then, later on I told them it was kangaroo. And they were left perplexed because they still liked it, but they didn't think they would. That's a normal human reaction. If you normalise change, often people get out the other side of change Tony Robbins does it with firewalking all the time, and they're so busy being caught up in doing it that they don't really recognise what's happened until afterwards, and that's the right time to analyse, right? Because if afterwards I didn't like it, now there's a productive discussion. But if I'm worrying about it before it happened, chances are I've got displaced grief. It's just very dysfunctional to lead in that. So that's a personal one. What about work? Make change boring. What if you're launching new software, new systems? Have we ever launched a new system in Queensland Health? No? We have, haven't we? We've had barbecues and balloons. Yeah, we've had parties about it. Again, sometimes policy-wise that's a great idea, but at the grassroots level, leading transformation, if you tell them all about the new software and how amazing it's going to be and it's going to change everything and rah, 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 particularly in government agencies that may or may not have had a good run with this stuff, they're going to roll their eyes, aren't they? They're going to say, yeah, that's what you told us last time. Anyone ever seen that? Again, leave your hands down if you have. But if you take this same principle about the comfort zone and make change boring, you can still launch this new software, but the launch of the software is in the comfort zone, which is our team, our division, has always been customer-centric. And it's still customer-centric, and it will remain customer-centric. And the number one thing you do is you get the calls and you process the things and you help make it a better day for the people on the other end and for our organisation. And so we're going to just change a couple of screen layouts around. We've got a bit of an upgrade coming, and we're going to, just make sure we can process that well. But again, the main game is continuing to do our customer service, albeit with some upgrades to the software coming the next few weeks, which we'll explain as we go. Which one of those exciting new rah-rah or comfort zone appeals to you more? You're going to be all pumped up about, that's great, I wanted to go and relearn a whole new system of operating, I had nothing else to do. That's exciting. Yeah. Or are you going to be like, oh yeah, okay, right, yeah, we've got to deal with that, but that's okay, the main game's still the main game. Make change boring, aim for the comfort zone. You'd be amazed how radical a change societies can go through and cope with when we try to communicate change in a more comfortable language. You'd be amazed. You can change people. People can change so radically when they don't think they have to, when they think it's just the normal, albeit the new normal. All right, the second one, these ones are a bit quicker. Let's look at our time. The overuse of positional power as leaders. Now, who's a parent? Who's a parent? Come on. There's only a few of you. Yeah, right. Have you ever told your kids, because I said so? Have you ever said, because I'm your mother? Because I'm your father? No, you have never done that? Yeah, I've done it. And it's bad karma, right? Yeah? What about, has anyone ever said that to their teenagers? Just me. You guys are so smart. Oh, man. And so what we know, of course, is people resist control more than they resist change. That's where the idea of reverse psychology comes from, right? You're going to do the opposite because whatever I say is going to invoke in you a sense I'm trying to control you. So, as clever parents, we tell our kids to do all sorts of silly activities because we think they'll do the opposite. And we think it just relates to teenagers, but it doesn't. It sort of kicks in those teenage years and it stays with us till the end of our lives. It does. It does. And so in an organisation, as leaders, you would know this. You're experts. You're the categories of leadership power. Okay? And investing time fully understanding this and saying, oh, I know how I do those things. Each one of them. I know how that happens. I know the words that roll off my tongue and that create these things. Understanding that is particularly important leading change. And one of the interesting things we listen to is the amount of you or we that goes on when the leader's talking about a change that's coming. That's fascinating. And that, whether they realise it or not, that belies something deeper about how the audience is hearing that message. And obviously you need to use all these forms of power. This is not a lecture to tell you positional power is bad. They're all essential. It's just that you don't want to have to use those cards if you don't have to. And most of the time we use those cards we don't want to use because we didn't use enough of the other stuff at the beginning. It's a pretty simple point. How did I get here that I'm issuing a directive? You still have to issue that directive and get through that, but please, with your peers and your coach, audit what went wrong. Chances are there was a missed opportunity. So next time, you may not end up in that spot. Number 3 in our classic leadership mistakes is the assumption of comprehension. Have you ever explained something to someone and asked them to do something? They went, yep, got it. And you went, sweet. And then later on, they just didn't do it? Not happening for you? Doesn't happen in this organisation? What about personally? You ever asked your spouse to do something? They went, roger that. And then they just point blank didn't do it? They just flipped you the bird? Maybe not physically, but... One of the biggest problems we have in particularly large organisations and particularly where there's a long tenure is the assumption of comprehension. We think that when we explain something to someone and they say, yes, I understand, we think that means they understand, don't we? And the longer we know people, the more we shorthand up how we communicate with one another. And in the end, like our spouse, we say, oh, can you make sure you pick up that thingy on the way to work? And they go, yeah, roger that. And then one day they get the thingy wrong, right? What was the thingy? Well, what's that thingy? And the longer you know someone as a leader, the less you know them, which is really counterintuitive again, isn't it? The less you know them in that moment because you're so familiar with one another. And familiarity breeds content, assumptions. And so the closest communication bias is something really important to understand in leading change. There's no more acute pressure point in post-mortems of change where you won't track it back to an assumption that came out of a meeting. We call it groupthink, where there was a critical moment where everybody didn't check something or make sure everybody understood. Yeah? Do you ever watch Air Crash Investigators? Anyone seen that? Or Engineering Disasters? I'm a boy, I love that stuff. Yeah, well, it usually rocks back down to this. And the less people know one another, the less this is likely. So what do? We have to over-communicate as leaders, and this is tricky. We have to answer the question. Don't answer the question, so did you tell them? Answer the question, how do you know that they know? How do you know? Where's your proof? As an executive coach, I do that a lot with leaders. Okay, that's great, and you've answered this, and you've done that, and you've done this. Tell me how you know they know. Oh. Well, I don't know how they know. I know what I did and I know I've done whatever, but I don't know they know. Again, if as leaders you can take that from today, how do you know they know? Because what that does is it forces you as a leader into a really productive place with your own communication. Makes you think more carefully about the words you use and the messages you bring. And it also gets you to understand, well, what did they see? What did they hear? How did you reinforce that message? How is there no other alternative but for them to get what they need to do through how you communicate it? And I say this one, falling foul of it myself all the time. And obviously I make mistakes in all of this, but this one's really tricky because it's so effortful to over-communicate. Because as I'm repeating it and you're starting to get irritated with me, I want to stop. I want you to like me. And when I stop too soon, the rest of the audience didn't get it. And so this one, why over-communicating is hard, is because of our own tendencies that once the fastest thinkers get the message, we turn off and we miss everybody else. The last one, then we'll do a little halftime check-in. The last one is leadership mistakes we make. The adjustment model. Now, in Australia, it's a sad fact that about 50% of marriages end in divorce. People familiar with that? Yeah, and I'm one of those scarred for life individuals that have been on that journey myself. And so with respect, one of the things we know about that process is that before a relationship ends, albeit simplifying it dramatically, typically one person isn't seeing it coming. Things are calm enough for them, and the level of the problems is still inside their idea of normal. And partner two, on the other hand, is sitting there going, oh, I think it could be better. I'm not happy with it. Then what we know in this simplified diagram is one of the parties calls it and says it's over, partner two in this illustration. And then as soon as they make that decision that they've been stewing about for such a long time, they become calmer. Oh, gee, I know it's a hard road ahead, but I feel like I made the right choice, albeit a difficult choice. But what about partner one? What happens to them in this little simplified discussion? They have a what the moment, don't they? Oh, come on. What do you mean the relationship's over? Look, when you said you were unhappy, I didn't think you were unhappy. Yeah? Oh, come on, we're all unhappy. That's like normal. Yeah, and then look what happens to them for the next period of time. Now, of course, we know that's a tremendously painful place for many of us to go. But if you get the simple narrative here, it becomes really useful for us at work. Because we might have a situation where staff are unhappy. But remember, that's their routine. So they might be frustrated about where the photocopiers are, or the fact that we've got to have a digit code to do things. And they regularly complain about the copiers or the digit code access. But it's their routine, isn't it? It's part of stability for them. It's part of a good day out. But we don't see it that way, and they probably don't see it that way. But remember, we understand what's going on beneath them. Then as leaders, we're sitting there going, oh my goodness, they don't like the PIN number. They're not happy with the photocopies. They're always complaining. What are we going to do? And so as leaders, we spend all our energy coming up with this stuff, and we work out, okay, we'll use these swipe cards so they don't need a PIN number, and we'll put copiers in different locations so they have to walk even less. Then we have this point of change. Hello, everyone. We've been listening to this problem about the PIN numbers and you forgetting, and we've been listening about the build-up of pressure getting things done. We've got a solution. From now on, you'll have a swipe card and there'll be a copier in every administrative room next to the business manager's office. We're done. And suddenly the leaders are like, oh, thank goodness, yes. They're going to stop complaining. It's going to be great. But then what happens? What? What? Are you going to give me another card I've got to carry around on my lanyard? What do you mean? What's with that? You didn't consult us to get rid of the PIN numbers? And what's going on with the new copiers? Are they going to be as simple to operate as the others? I don't know if I can cope with this. And as leaders, you feel like you're taking crazy pills, don't you, in that moment? Like, what? And so this is the rub here, isn't it? That person's angst about the new swipe card and photocopier, if you can conceptualise it as similar to that person in that relationship that now is going through change, you can learn something really important about what you need to do as a leader in response to that. What is it I need to do in response? As leaders, we fall foul of arguing with these staff. Yeah? You ever had a reasonableness discussion or a logic discussion? Have you ever argued with your spouse late at night when they're tired and you're tired? It's typically not very productive. In the same way, if there's actually no legitimate problem with the swipe card photocopier solution and it genuinely addresses the other thing, you need to see it as an adjustment process, don't you? Give them time, empathise with them, and let it play out. But often as leaders, we don't do that. We actually start arguing with them, pointing out the number of times they complained before, and we get into this stoush with them instead of letting it play out because we don't recognise what it is. We didn't recognise at the start that all that complaining was business as usual for them. We thought it was because they were genuinely unhappy about it. And now we don't recognise that all this other stuff now is simply adjustment. And so our empathy drops and our frustration grows. So if what's going on in the change process could be related to this, it dramatically changes how as a leader you lead change at that point. You need to stay the course at that point in the journey. Okay? You need to empathise with them. Really tough stuff, particularly if they're accusing you of stuff as well. On top of all of that, you've got to have big shoulders to lead transformational change. It's hard. And avoid the temptation when they're quite upset to use logic and reason. Again, so many times we fall into that trap of doing reason and logic. Okay? There's a time for that when everyone's calm and genuinely want an alternative, but there's not a time for that when people are in the throes of simply being upset because their routine has changed. We've got to work that out because that's not immediately obvious. Let's keep moving. So the last part of our time together here, the third thing, very much now on the solution-focused side of the equation, is how do we fast-track change? Well, can you even fast-track change is another good question. If we've got multiple changes running, we need to get them settled in and over as quick as possible, right? If you have too many pots boiling, too many plates spinning, the odds of one breaking go up. So we need to, as leaders, know what's the shortest, fastest way to get our teams into whatever's new. That, to me, would be the holy grail. That would be the worthwhile thing. And the good news is there's definitely some principles that we can apply into what we're doing. And if we apply those principles, we can absolutely guarantee the shortest possible change curve. We can absolutely guarantee that. So that's our last bit of our time today. The 4 factors that we say sit on the change fast track. If we get these things right, we speed up the rate at which people adapt. Those 4 things are pretty standard, things you'd expect from a psychologist, of course. Reduce pain and increase pleasure. Structures that enable new behaviour. This notion of try before you buy, and then having realistic timeframes. That's a tricky one at the end. Let's unpack these now. Reduce pain and increase pleasure. I guess we could talk from a Freudian perspective about that, which certainly would be entertaining. But instead we're going to talk from a safety culture, workplace health and safety design. The easiest way to get people to do the right thing, or the new thing, is to make the right thing, or the new thing, the easiest thing to do. And of course, we know that in society, don't we? Start thinking about concretising this change principle. Because if you can see that sign and you're driving along and maybe you're just a fraction over, you've got an opportunity for pain or pleasure, don't you? Yeah, you do. And, you know, what we know is the vast majority of people select pleasure, as in they just make sure they're under 60 as they keep driving. Would that be true? Very few people, when the gate post is there, say, oh, good, 60. I'll see if I can get it up to 80. Nobody does that. What if our workplace changed? What if we thought about what it is we want to change at work that just made doing the right thing the default? Mining is always an interesting, and then, oil and gas, it's always interesting when you talk about safety culture and you go and see how they tackle stuff. Because they work on a precognitive basis. They're trying to design a safe workplace on the assumption people aren't thinking. And I think in education and health, there is so much we could learn about what they do. There is so many great illustrations. And the obvious one, of course, is their PPE, their personal protective equipment. They put that right next to where it's needed. The high-vis vests are there at the shed. They don't ask you to launder it and keep it fresh and clean and bring it in your car and store it in your boot. They're increasing the risk of error. So what they do is, when you need the safety gear, it's right there. And you actually have to kind of almost trip over it to go and do the more risky thing. They make it really easy. If we were implementing major change, how could we make this new behaviour? A lot of our change is more abstract and complex. Nonetheless, how do we make the new thing the easy thing? We already know the new thing's harder simply by the fact we've changed someone's routine. And the flip side of that is, how do we make the old way the harder way? Because by default, the old way is the routine, is therefore the easy way. Things to think about. We often don't see change and we're going to adjust this and that in the process to rapidly make the outdated way too difficult and to rapidly ensure that the new way becomes easy. We see this a lot where they still leave the old software running, or you can still access the old forms on the share drive or whatever, and naturally you could have deleted those or just blocked them outright. And if we think about that, that leads us to this next principle for transformational change. Changing structures. When you change a structure around a team and a workforce, you by default are forcing a new behaviour to occur. But sometimes, and that might sound strange, but sometimes what we do is we don't change the structure. What we do instead is we start encouraging people to try things out for a while. And then when the will of the people is strong enough, they all voluntarily, turn off the old thing and turn on the new thing. And again, there's a theory about why that's supposed to work. And it just does not work. It just does not work. Again, in safety, we know this. If there's a ditch, there's this hazard, physical hazard, or even a psychosocial hazard. If there's a big hazard, big hole in the ground, Okay, if you're taking a structural approach to making that safe and changing everyone's behaviour, because it's in the middle of the footpath where everybody normally walks, you're going to put a fence up, aren't you? Because they normally walk there and then they can't, there's a fence, so they just walk around the fence. Yeah? Simple? But often in workplaces, there's a new hole in the ground and you change, you know. And instead of putting a new fence up, we take an emotionally intelligent coaching approach. So we go, hey, you're coming up to the hole, you look like super bright and intelligent and I'm sure you're brilliant. So there's a hole there and please walk around it. It's just bad to fall in. Thanks so much. And instead of putting the fence up, we exhaust ourselves in all this relationally driven change. Now, I like it when people tell me I'm really smart and not walk in the hole. But do you reckon someone, no matter how your great coaching questions and your encouragement, do you reckon there'd be someone who'd want to go in the hole? Yeah, of course there is. Hey, you're great and wonderful and blah, blah, blah. Don't walk in the hole. Hang on. Yeah, I am great and wonderful. Did you just tell me I can't walk in the hole? Did you just tell me that I'm not allowed to walk in that hole? Who are you to tell me? No, this is a free country, buddy. If I want to walk in that hole, I'm going to walk in the hole. Surely we've seen that. Has anyone seen the equivalent of that? Reverse psychology, remember? Building on today. And so often organisations, by changing the structure of what's going on, fast-track change. And often they delay the implementation of structure and expect common sense to prevail. And that, we get it wrong. We get it wrong. And remember, we can't keep everyone happy during change. Change itself is a negative experience from psychology. So what we have to do is pick the least intrusive, the most ethical, the most humane way to do things. And the safest way to do things. So have a think about structures. The other one, of course, is airport security. Has anyone been through airport security lately? Why do they make you go through it over and over again if you travel a lot? Honestly. I mean, seriously, none of you look like terrorists. You don't. You look like really reasonable people. Can't you get a sticker for the week? Did you ever think about that? Why can't you just have a pass? Why can't you just have yep, he travels a lot. He got his bag checked the other day. I think it's reasonable to assume he's going to keep doing it. But we'll only give him a week because he's a bit dodgy. They don't do that, do they? The more critical an issue, the more structured the intervention. Yeah? And everybody, the language of we all get checked. And we continue to get checked. And most of us don't ever second guess or feel like there's something wrong with us at airport security, do we? We just do it because it's routine. But when we first introduced checking, was that a bit argy-bargy? Those of us who are old like me and remember? It was a massive change, wasn't it? And so they stuck to their structures and we all habituated. Number 3, people need to be exposed to your ideas. Try before you buy. And they need to have experienced it at least 3 times. These are advertising theories. I always thought the single point of truth in psychology is marketing and advertising. Because they've got skin in the game to know what people are really going to do, don't they? Researchers, yeah, they've got models and scientific things to do, and that's interesting. But you get to where the rubber hits the road, it's advertising. Has anyone ever seen a car commercial? Yeah? What they are doing in that car commercial is they're exposing you to the brand. Okay? BMW or Toyota or whatever it might be. They're saying it, they're visually cueing it. Yeah? They're getting 20 exposures inside 27 seconds. All that different repetition. Toyota's really interesting with this one. Then, remember the recipe? There's got to be 3 experiences as well before I'll even start to get motivated to actually do the behaviour you want me to do. So in a car commercial, they do that by having at least 3 scenes of someone driving it going, look at me, I'm awesome. So that's called in vivo experience. You're watching someone else experience it. Their gorgeous partner going, you are awesome for driving this car. Okay, experience number 2. And experience number 3 is usually someone walking along feeling jealous. If only I had that car, I'd be a winner. And then Toyota get number 4 always, don't they? Because what's on the back of what a feeling? A physical person jumping in the air. If you could design the introduction of your change, even as good as a basic car commercial, because how many times do you watch that commercial? Yeah, so every commercial contains the ingredients, and you'll watch 10 to 20 of those commercials. So you are totally cult hypnotised by the time you visit the dealership at Toyota, right? Most leaders I work with, when I explain that, they are a bit perplexed. And then we explain, you can share your experience of something ahead of time. You can, guerrilla market, have a conversation about whatever it is that's coming and your experience with it well before staff experience it. And of course, as we often do quite well, you can actually start the imagery, the visual landscape of what's coming well ahead of when it comes. The other one that might be a little closer to home is mobile phones. Has anyone bought a mobile phone? I'm worried, no one's on phones here. It's not just high expense items we have to try before you buy. It's high use items, isn't it? Once you're an iPhone person, you tend to stay there. Once you're Android, you tend to stay there. And this is what's our most high use item in our lifespan? It's our work routine. Just starting to bring this together, isn't it? 34% of our lives. What's the second most high use? It's actually our phone. How many times a day do we check our phones? Anyone? Yeah, it varies. The marketers will tell you the average sort of adult, midlife, 180 times a day. Kids are much higher. So any high routine thing, you're not going to just move all your apps around. You're not going to just switch your SIM card. You're going to take a very careful view before you make a change to how you use your phone. We all know that, right? But that's your work life. That's what you're asking your staff to do when you introduce change. You're fiddling with the apps on their phone. You're swapping out the SIM card in their break. No wonder they're getting angst. No wonder there's a bit of argy-bargy. If you're going to fiddle with their phone, and every time you change their work, you're fiddling with their phone, try to own that emotionally. Try to think that out. And then try to say, what have I done to decrease the likelihood they're going to be irritated? Because I have to fiddle with their phone. That's my job. Charles Darwin told us, we're in the fourth industrial revolution, I have to fiddle with your phone, and you don't get a say in it, so I better recognise that's what I'm doing and start to think about how I'm doing that and what that's doing to you. Last one, realistic time frames. Any carefully planned new product or initiative will take twice as long as predicted. And any poorly planned is 3 times. Now, engineering firms know this, right? And that's why you can have an early completion bonus on a bridge or, dare I say, a hospital. Because when they timeline it, they have to allow, this is quantum physics, this is a project management principle, the gaps between everything make up double. Pretty simple idea. Pretty simple idea. Has anyone ever built a house? Yes, sir. What about major reno? Come on, some of you have got to do some renos. Did it take exactly the amount of time the builder said? You lucked in and won the lotto. The rest of us, did it take approximately double? In my case, I've done lots of renos and it's usually double. And some of us are still going, what about this? Forget the house. Has anyone ever tried to get fit or lose weight? You just leave your hands down. I'll just put mine up. Yep. Did it take twice as long to get to that target? Or you're like me and, I don't know, everyone's gone home and I'm still on the target. I'm still trying. Yeah? Things take time. How long does it take to change? Depends what you're changing at work, doesn't it? If you're changing someone's role or duties, and you can line up all 4 things we've just talked about, it's 1 to 3 months before it becomes a habit. 66 days to change a habit. Yeah, see, it takes a bit of time. If you can't try before you buy, if you can't line up the structure properly, if you can't solve the pain and pleasure, it could take up to 6 months before a routine role change is unconsciously competent. What about policies and procedures? We do a lot of that work with high-performance teams. We change procedures. We change the process of how the team works. Okay? Again, 3 to 6 months before that's not a head trip. That's not irritating to me. I get that. That's new and normal. Or anywhere up to 12 months. Again, if I can't line up some of these issues. Professional practices. Do you ever change the practices of your health staff? Do they ever change? Is there ever a new standard around clinical care that comes out? No? Been doing it the same way since the 20s? Have a look. Takes time. Okay, this is behavioural psychology on the screen. This isn't what I'd like to see happen, This is the nature of the human being. And what you'll notice then is typically as an organisation, we don't code for this, we don't program for it, and we roll multiple procedure changes on someone simultaneously. That may or may not be anything we can do anything about, except as leaders have better insight and better empathy. And sometimes that alone is enough. Finally, who'd like certain people to have a better attitude at work? Does anyone think attitudinal change is a good thing? Yeah, you're all really happy with the attitude. That's good. But you can see if I'm directly trying to change an attitude, that's the hardest thing to change of all, isn't it? Now remember, someone can wake up tomorrow and be happy or sad. That's their choice. But if you're going to go head to head and try and drag that person into a positive attitude, you've got a 2-year campaign. So all of the geniuses in the room, in other words, the whole room, we're all going, hang on a minute. That means whatever I do, I need to try and draw it back and change something up the top of the screen to get the result at the bottom. You with me? That's the genius. You want to spend far more of your time conceptualising whatever it is down the bottom you want to see and working out how to turn it into a role change, how to tweak the procedure. Don't worry about the end game, that'll take a long time. But if you can boil it back, if you want a great attitude and you can have a better meet and greet or huddle cycle as we do with teams, then it's just a matter of time. The attitude will take care of itself if the process is right. That's what the really wise leaders of change do. So fast tracking, it's just about getting all 4 success factors lined up. It's about starting with whatever's coming and saying, what is that? Is that going to change their role and their duties around? Is that going to change the process of how they work? Are there new standards that they're going to have to adjust to? Or do they absolutely have to have an attitudinal shift? Once I know that, I know my end game, the amount of time it could take, and therefore I can predict the amount of disruption if I'm not given that time. If it's next week we start. Then at least I can start to work my way back and say, well, what is within my power? What can I do differently in how I lead this change using those 4 questions? Because if you can answer those 4 questions ahead of time, and if your change meets the criteria of what those questions tell you, you have a double-headed coin. You have certainty of success. Look, I hope that gives you some practical things you can do with change. We know change is the only constant in life. And we've also talked about our 4th industrial revolution. And we've talked about how change is ramping. We also know that change is with us for the rest of our lives, okay? And particularly in our workplaces, not just in our personal experiences of change. And we think about this African proverb, if you want to go far, you need to go together. And so in all that we've learnt today, we need to embrace, again, this idea of not doing this on our own, this idea of doing this as a team, this idea of collaboration, this idea that we'll do this better if we do it together. And you'll grab this on your way out, but Naomi's written the foreword to a high-performance teams book. And in there, she tells us that as leaders, getting our teamwork right and getting our teams right across the HHS will be fundamental to the success of leading the Sunshine Coast Way and delivering on our culture of care strategy. And of course, if we get our teamwork working well, we're going to achieve more, okay? We're going to share the load more, and in doing so, that's going to be fantastic for us. Yes, for our staff, we're going to enjoy our work more. But importantly, it's going to be better for our patients and our community, the core reason that we're here. Thank you.